After my father's funeral, my brother-in-law abruptly joined the conversation about inheritance. He announced that the stocks and $5 million inheritance would go to my wife, the eldest daughter. This surprised my sister and brother-in-law, who were eager for the money. However, the lawyer then told us that my sister Kelly had no right to the inheritance. Let me explain a bit about myself. I'm John Watson, a 42-year-old sales worker with a wife and 2 kids. My father was a major shareholder in a company and still worked actively at 78. I have an older sister named Kelly who's significantly older than me. She's always been a troublemaker for our parents due to her bad behavior. Kelly, now in her middle age, doesn't hold a stable job and lives freely. I've never been close to my sister, especially because of her behavior. At 50, she suddenly brought home a man named Chris Adams, much younger than her but didn't leave a good impression due to his laziness and rude behavior. Kelly shamelessly demanded money from our father for their wedding and spent it quickly, asking for more. Sadly, not long after their marriage, our father collapsed while playing golf and passed away a few days later. This was devastating news for us. I was deeply saddened, along with our family and friends. After the funeral, while my mother and I were finally able to rest, a lawyer visited us to discuss the inheritance. It turned out that my father had left a will, and my mother and I were informed about it beforehand. However, my sister and her smiling brother-in-law, unaware of the situation, barged into the inheritance discussion and made a shocking claim. The stocks and $5 million inheritance would go to my wife, the eldest daughter. They asked us not to act arbitrarily. My mother and I were left speechless by this sudden announcement. "We did it, Kelly. Now I can be rich too instead of mourning our father," my brother-in-law exclaimed joyfully. The lawyer, clearly surprised, responded firmly, "Kelly, you don't have any inheritance rights." My sister and her husband were taken aback. "What are you talking about? That's impossible, right? Kelly is the eldest daughter of this family." They protested confidently. It seemed my brother-in-law was banking on this inheritance, thinking my sister would receive it. However, the lawyer, looking serious, quietly informed them, "Didn't you know? Kelly is not the biological child of the late Mrs. Watson." Suddenly, my sister's expression changed as she turned to look at our mother. "Mom?" she asked, her face filled with a mix of shock and confusion. Our mother had an indescribable expression on her face. I knew that my sister was a half-sibling, but it seemed she was unaware. In a near frenzy, my sister started shaking our mother's shoulders, pleading, "Mom, what does this mean? Kelly, you are the child of my previous husband." That was all our mother managed to mutter in response. My sister, who had teased me since childhood with comments like, "Daddy thinks I'm cuter," now wore an incredulous expression. But as she was legally adopted, she should have inheritance rights. My brother-in-law suddenly exclaimed, "Right, Kelly? Yes, that's right," he added confidently. However, our mother shook her head. "There was no legal adoption," she explained. My sister and her husband looked shocked. "Again, that's impossible." "I am the eldest daughter. Even Dad said so." My sister shouted angrily, glaring at me. "I won't let you monopolize the inheritance," she declared. I was irritated by her attitude and retorted, "After all the money Dad spent on you? You still say that? Shut up. I'm his daughter too. I have every right." My brother-in-law chimed in, "Right. What's wrong with spending money on a daughter?" I sighed involuntarily. Normal expenditures for a daughter would have been fine, but my sister had used our father's money to pay off debts and settle troubles. At this point, John, the lawyer who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Why don't we show Kelly the will too?" he suggested. "The will? I don't know anything about that," my sister panicked. Her ignorance, however, was her own fault. Our father had wanted to discuss the will's contents with us and had asked us to be present during its making. However, my sister scoffed and went out to play instead of taking the matter seriously. When I pointed this out, my brother-in-law glared at her fiercely, questioning her actions. Faced with this confrontation, they finally agreed to hear what the lawyer had to say. The lawyer then revealed my father's will, which clearly stated that the inheritance was to be left to me and my mother. It also explained why my father chose not to adopt my sister. Initially, he had intended to, but he became disappointed with her behavior towards me, her half-brother, and her reckless spending as she grew older. Understanding that she had no inheritance rights, my sister was stunned. "Damn it! What are you going to do now?" My brother-in-law suddenly raised his voice. "You deceived me. You said you had money." His demeanor turned rough, surprising both my mother and sister, though I wasn't shocked. My brother-in-law had often shown his gold-digging tendencies. Perhaps he even married my sister under false pretenses. "Kelly, don't come back until you get some money." "Wait, Chris, what do you mean by that?" My sister protested in confusion. "I thought I was going to be rich. What a disappointment." Roughly pushing my sister aside, my brother-in-law quietly left the room. Left behind, my sister glared at us with a red face and exclaimed, "Mom, why didn't you arrange for me to be adopted? It's unfair that only you get the inheritance. I should have received something too, but you didn't handle it properly." In front of our flustered mother, my sister cried out, "It's unfair. It's terrible," while sobbing and messing up her hair. I was taken aback by her terrifying appearance, but the lawyer seemed unfazed, perhaps used to such scenes. "Why does only he get it?" "Because I'm Dad's son," I explained calmly. Hearing this, my sister's eyes widened in anger, and she lunged at me, shouting, "It would have been better if you never existed." Reflecting quietly to myself, I realized that even if I hadn't been born, my father would likely have made the same decision given the kind of person my sister is. Before I could say anything, the lawyer gently intervened, warning my sister that her actions could become a police matter. My sister flinched, perhaps affected by the mention of the police due to her past involvement in shoplifting incidents. When our mother called out to her with tears in her eyes, my sister clicked her tongue in annoyance and left the room. Half a year has passed since then, and the inheritance procedures were completed smoothly without any issues. My sister and brother-in-law grumbled for a while, but thanks to the lawyer's efficient handling, they had no opportunity to interfere. My mother gave my sister some money, but I don't feel it's my place to comment on that. What really upset me was that my sister and her husband disappeared with the money. Their blatant greed disgusted our relatives who were aware of the situation. Then one day, I went out to eat with my mother, wife, and daughter. Upon my wife's suggestion, my mother, who had been somewhat withdrawn since my father's passing, seemed brighter in the company of her adorable granddaughter. "Hey, Mom, why don't you move in with us?" I suggested, "but you know Kelly might come by sometimes." "Sis only comes to beg for money, right?" "Don't be too lenient with her," my wife added. My mother hesitated understandably, considering that my sister is her biological daughter. Also, if our family moved into the family home, my sister might cause trouble again. Understanding her concerns, I simply asked her to consider it and drove towards the family home to drop her off. When we arrived at the supposedly empty house, we noticed lights were on. It wasn't the time for the housekeeper to be there, so we suspected my sister might have returned. With that thought, I parked the car in the garage. "We should stop by for a cup of coffee," I suggested as we got out of the car and started walking towards the entrance. Suddenly, a car drove dangerously towards us. Hearing my daughter's voice, I instinctively shielded my wife. Ouch! Fortunately, the car only grazed me, throwing me against a nearby flower bed. My body took the impact hard, but the car stopped after hitting the garage entrance. "Are you okay, dear?" My wife and daughter rushed over to help me up, while my mother stood trembling at the entrance, understandably shocked. Chaos ensued, and I was taken to the hospital by ambulance, where I had to stay for a day. Later, I learned that the driver was Chris Adams, my brother-in-law. He apparently told the police that he mistook the accelerator for the brake, but I doubted his story. When my mother and sister came to visit me in the hospital, my sister coldly looked at me and said disappointedly, "You're surprisingly tough, aren't you?" I thought to myself, just as I suspected. If I had been seriously injured in the accident, my mother would have inherited everything. My bad luck for you, my sister smirked. Mom said she would renounce her inheritance from me, so doing such a thing is just a waste of time. My sister seemed surprised to hear this and couldn't comprehend why someone would refuse an inheritance. I have a wife and kids, so she asked me to pass it on to them. That's what parents do, I explained. But I even made a will early on, following Dad's example. My sister's mouth fell open upon hearing this. So then, unfortunately, my share won't go to Mom anymore, I added firmly. My sister trembled and shook as she looked at me. Give me at least a little. There's $5 million, right? When I flatly refused, my sister's face twisted into a demonic expression, and she grabbed my collar. Give me half. I'm your sister. She screamed in an unusual voice, possibly driven mad by her desire for the inheritance. Don't you understand that your greediness disappointed Dad? I calmly responded. My sister's face turned red with rage, and she grabbed at my throat. Kelly, what are you doing? My mother returned and raised her voice. Nurses called by the nurse call system then escorted my sister out. My mother seemed to want to defend my sister. It was painful to watch my mother express her sadness, questioning where she went wrong in raising my sister, as my sister hurled insults at her. Soon after, my mother was found to have an illness. As she grew weaker, my wife and I started helping out with transportation and household chores at the family home. Apparently, this offended my sister. She probably ran into my wife when she came to ask for money or heard about it from my mother. One day, my sister called my phone and abruptly said, "From now on, we'll take care of Mom. You guys don't need to come." I was caught off guard and tried to reason with her, but my sister didn't listen and hung up, claiming it was already decided. I confirmed with my wife, and she had been told the same thing and was brushed away. Worried that my sister, who had never cared for a sick person or done household chores, could handle this responsibility, I hastily contacted my mother. Surprisingly, it turned out that my brother-in-law had some experience in caregiving, and my mother was still independent enough, so it seemed there wouldn't be a problem for now. I felt somewhat relieved. However, within a month, my mother was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance due to a mistake with her medication dosage. When our family hurried to the hospital, my mother looked alarmingly frail. The doctor was puzzled because she had never made such a mistake before. Leaving my wife to accompany her, I went to the family home, which was in disarray. The fridge was empty despite my mom's love for cooking, and apparently, the helper service had been unilaterally canceled. I felt ashamed for even slightly trusting my sister and was infuriated. A significant amount of money had been withdrawn from my mother's bank account, though the bank card and PIN were safe. Fortunately, the account containing the inheritance was safe in a safe deposit box, but almost all the money set aside for living expenses was gone. I gathered the necessary items for my mother's hospital stay along with her bank card and returned to explain the situation to her. My mother seemed unaware of the bank card situation, but when I asked about the medication mistake, she looked gloomy and said it was prepared by my brother-in-law. "Mom, it's better not to let my sister into that house anymore," I suggested. "John, I said I would take care of you, but the house is in terrible condition, and you've lost so much weight. Haven't you been fed properly?" my mother asked, looking downhearted. "Mom, you should live with us after all. I'll build a house where we can live together," I said, and as I spoke, my mother burst into tears. However, her health worsened. After my mother's passing, I returned to the family home to prepare for the funeral and discovered that all the valuables were missing. It seemed my sister and brother-in-law had taken them in their desperation for money. Standing in the empty house, I was stunned and filled with intense anger, vowing to make them pay for their actions. The day after my mother's funeral, my sister and I were supposed to meet with the lawyer, presumably to discuss the inheritance. My sister boldly declared that the inheritance from Mom belonged to her daughter. I couldn't help but burst into laughter at her statement, as she seemed to be misunderstanding something. When the lawyer revealed the will, my sister's face lost all color. No, why? She explained. Kelly is not to inherit anything. That was Mom's last wish, the lawyer explained. My brother-in-law lashed out in disbelief, but the lawyer repeated the same statement. That's ridiculous. Kelly is that old woman's child. My brother-in-law shouted, sweeping things off the table in anger. You can't fool us. Hand over the inheritance now. Chris, you tried to harm my mom, didn't you? I accused my brother-in-law. Irritated, he denied any wrongdoing, dismissing the medication mistake. Why did you make a mistake with her medication then? I pressed. My brother-in-law scoffed. Who cares about that, John? It's crazy that I don't get any inheritance. What did you do? My sister is going insane again. I can't even pay for my apartment now. My sister cried out, revealing her reliance on the inheritance for her expenses. I was shocked by her callousness. Instead of rushing over after hearing of our mother's death, she was counting on the inheritance for her financial stability. Tell me it's not true. I get nothing, my sister confronted the lawyer. The lawyer carefully explained the compulsory portion of the inheritance and concluded that after deducting the amount my sister had withdrawn and the items she sold, it almost amounted to zero. My sister scratched her head in frustration. That can't be true. It can't be so little, my sister muttered to herself. Unbeknownst to my sister and me, the majority of my mother's estate had already been gifted to my daughters, her grandchildren, during her lifetime. That's why the amount available for inheritance was so small. My sister seemed dissatisfied. Mom was happy thinking you'd take care of her, but you just took her money and left. You ungrateful wretch! I couldn't help but shout in anger. Giving costs money, you know, my sister retorted defensively. Then show me the detailed expenses you used for Mom's living costs. I'll cover the necessary expenses, I challenged, holding out my hand. I don't have anything like that, my sister stammered, her face turning pale. That won't do. Without receipts, it can't be recognized, the lawyer pressed. Caught off guard by my immediate response, my brother-in-law was momentarily speechless. Despite his persistence, I refused to help my sister. If things had gone smoothly at that time, Kelly would have had the entire inheritance, my brother-in-law grumbled, inadvertently revealing his intentions. What do you mean by that time? I questioned, but before I could get an answer, my brother-in-law accidentally spilled the beans, complaining about his car troubles. That's quite a statement. It sounds like fraud, the lawyer smiled, holding a recorder. Realizing his mistake, my brother-in-law turned pale. I informed him that I would be pressing charges about the accident. Don't be ridiculous. There's no evidence, my brother-in-law protested. You just provided the evidence yourself, I pointed out. My sister began to cry and shake my brother-in-law in frustration, realizing the gravity of their situation. Eventually, my brother-in-law faced criminal charges, and it seemed his past misdemeanors also came to light. My sister, as an accomplice, faced a lesser sentence. Unable to pay for her apartment, my sister went to relatives to beg for money but was turned down by everyone. As for me, I continued to work hard without relying on inheritance, finding small pleasures in looking forward to stock dividends.